Welcome back to episode 2 of Notes from My Journal with Faye Faye. Today we have an amazing guest, no other than Tola of Returntoselfpodcast. It is an amazing and insightful listen, and we came together to, talk about everything in between trusting your intuition. We enjoyed working with this as much as we know you would enjoy listening to it as well.
Hi.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you are here. I'm glad to be here as well. I'll do a little introduction. So I met you on Instagram, followed your podcast, and I was in awe. I'm like, okay, I need to get this person on my podcast because I love what you do. I respect what you do. And I'm glad after all some hiccups here and there, we were finally able to record this. Welcome.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for reaching out.
All right. Today, we'll be talking about intuition and how we can trust our intuition. And after this conversation, I'll read a short journal I So I would like to ask, what's your own perspective about intuition? Some people call it, religiously. Some say it's Holy Spirit. Some say it's intuition. Some people say it's guidance. What's your own point of view about this?
So I fully believe in intuition. There's something that Oprah said on one of her Super Soul Sunday episodes, which is, life speaks to you in whispers. And for me, that is intuition. I always feel that in most situations, there is an inner voice that's telling you something. Sometimes it's not as easy to decode as other times. Sometimes there's a lot of noise, so you can't really hear it as clearly. Sometimes you don't want to hear it. Mm-hmm. But I do think that whisper is there. And I also think that after a while, it becomes a much more louder voice, especially if it's something that you really are supposed to learn and you really are supposed to hear. So fully subscribe with this notion of intuition and it being a very powerful force in our lives.
I do agree with you 100% because I like rightly said, sometimes it's a very, very mild voice, and sometimes it becomes like really, really strong, and you're like, okay, if I don't listen to this now, there's nothing else I can do. For me, I strongly believe in intuition. Growing up, I've had this thing of being an highly sensitive human being, so I could pick up cues really fast. However, it's into my adult life I started getting more aware about, oh, this is intuition, oh, this is this is that, and so looking back and now I've come to realize that there are times we do listen to our intuition and that sometimes we don't, and they come with consequences. For example, I'll give an example is so when I moved here early on, like some almost 8 years ago, the system of buying bus tickets and all. So I was going to service and I got to a particular bus stop. For some reason, I was hearing this loud, voice or feeling, that I should get off the bus stop. I'm like, I'm not there. I'm not at my bus stop yet. Why should I stop here? It's weird to me, And then apparently there was checkers in the bus. So what happened was, I didn't know at the time. I had my ticket, right? But I was supposed to clock it in on the bus. But because I was in a hurry, I just had a card with me and didn't. when they checked me, I was like, oh yeah, I confidently showed the card, and they're like, oh, you didn't clock it, so I got fined. And then I got back to myself, like, oh my god, I should just stop at the previous bus stop, and I would have avoided all this. But it didn't make sense to me at that time. If you get what I mean. So yeah, this is one example of trusting one's intuition. Sometimes they speak to you because early on, but because logically it might not sound right, someone might not really tend to follow it. But I'm glad those are little decisions, and in bigger ones I tend to listen. I would say. Do you sometimes have this kind of experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, recently I had this recently with my son. So about 2 weeks ago, my son had a very high temperature, and
Right.
we brought him home from school. His temperature was 106. We brought
Mm.
him home from school. We took him to the hospital. They said he had malaria. But my intuition just didn't. I didn't agree. But
Right.
I still thought, okay, let me give it like a day or two. And so I gave it 1 or 2 days, and by I think day 3, he woke up still with a fever. It had gone down a little bit, but it was still high. It was 104.
Right. Wow.
And I just knew, like, this is not malaria. And I knew that it was dangerous.
Right.
I felt very strongly that if I didn't do something, this situation could go left very quickly. But at the same time, I think that's the challenge with intuition. At the same time,
Yeah.
there's another part of your brain that tries to talk you out of it. So I was like, okay, well, maybe I should just give it some time. I do have quite a bit of work to do. Should I do? And, that whisper just kind of started to get louder.
Right.
And I decided to take him to the hospital, to a different hospital. So I take him to the hospital, and his temperature is still rising. The doctor is pretty alarmed at his temperature, and looks at his throat and tells me that my son has a raging infection in his tonsils that has now spread to his throat, and everything is swollen, everything is red, and it's an infection, and we need to get it under control immediately. And they run some tests, and he brings me the tests, and he's like, these tests show that your son has so much infection, etc., etc., etc. And so they put him on a drip
Right.
immediately and start pumping these drugs into him. And while this is happening, even then I'm happy. I feel like, okay, it's a good thing I trusted my intuition because
Yes.
my son was very sick. But at the same time, there's still a little voice in me saying, like, does he really have a throat infection? That's so strange because he's never said anything was wrong with his throat. Like, he's been eating for the last couple of days. But in any case, I'm like, okay, let's just get this under control. So and it's quite an ordeal what he has to go through, right? Like putting the needle, my son is 3. So putting the needle into his arm, they had to do it twice. Each time he would have this scream that I've never heard him scream before, right?
So painful. Yeah.
Yeah. And every time they put the drugs in, that also hurts. So, he'd be crying, mommy, mommy, mommy. And this is all just one day. So day 2 rolls around, and he's feeling better. And he's asking me, can we go home? He gets my slippers, puts them in front of me, gets his shoes, put them in front of him. He's like, it's time to go home. I want to go home now. I want to go wear my gecko costume.
Yeah.
No, not gecko, sorry, Catboy. And, we're waiting for the doctor to come in, and the doctor says, oh, you guys still have to stay. He still has to be on drip. There's so much mucus in his throat. That's what's causing him to cough, because at this point he's developed a cough he didn't have prior. And so my brother is a doctor, so I'm sort of informing my brother as this is going on. And for my brother, he's starting to get weird red flags, right? Because if my son is eating, he doesn't need to be on drip. You know what I mean?
Right.
I send him the list of drugs, and he calls me immediately, and he says, we don't give this to, just in the medical profession, we don't give this to kids, and we don't give it to people that have throat infections, because the doctor had my son on ciprofloxacin, gentamicin, and one other that I forget, that's mainly for stomach infections.
Right.
So anyways, I sent this all to my brother. My brother is not pleased, to say the least, and he is like, these people don't know how to do medicine. You need to tell, at first he's like, you need to tell them to just take him off all these drugs. So I go downstairs and I talk to the doctor, and I'm still thinking, I'm still in two minds at this point, because my
Right.
son did get better.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a part of us, especially, being Nigerian, that just doesn't want to ruffle. There's a part of us that has been conditioned to not want to ruffle feathers, right? I think that's the part that
100%.
doesn't listen to our intuition. So there's one side of me that's thinking, my brother is telling me to run for the hills, I should run. And there's another part of me that's thinking, oh, but maybe this guy does know what he's doing.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't ruffle feathers, etc. So anyway, I go and talk to the doctor anyway. And long story short is, what he says to me was very frightening. He basically confirms my brother's theory that his approach to medicine is to give kids, once they're sick, give them everything. Give them every antibiotic, administer the drip for 48 hours, and then dovetail into what they actually need, which I just think is a very dangerous way to do medicine. You don't know if my son is allergic. You have none of this. So in that moment, my intuition kicks in again, and it's saying, you need to leave.
Right.
You need to leave. But then I'm also worried, okay, but what if I go home and his fever spikes? But, and for a split second, I consider staying. And this is when I say life speaks to you in whispers, and sometimes it gets louder. When I considered staying, it was very clear to me, like my body almost reacted to that thought.
Yeah.
And so I grabbed my son, needle still in his arm, took him out of there. Left all my stuff there, except my wallet and my keys, took him out. And went to a third doctor that my brother had recommended. And that doctor says to me, your son, he looks at the tests that the other doctor did and says, based on these tests, your son doesn't actually have a bacterial infection.
Can you imagine?
So he doesn't need to be on antibiotics. And then he checks his throat, and his throat is clear. So he's like, not only does he not have a bacterial infection, there's nothing wrong with his throat. And for what the doctor was saying, for what the doctor was making you believe, there's no way he had that yesterday. There. Right?
Interesting.
So my son was clearly sick, but it was more likely viral, and we had him tested for COVID. It wasn't COVID, so we figured, okay, fine, maybe it's just a viral infection. But the reason I say that story is I think my intuition served me both ways. I think I do think that I did the right thing by taking him out of the house on Thursday morning to another doctor, because the rate at which his fever was rising and spiking, I do believe was dangerous.
Yeah.
But I also think my intuition kicked in when it was time to leave, right? I think I firmly believe that if I had not left, that doctor would have continued to make up reasons for me to stay, and I would have probably ended up staying there for like 4 days.
Yeah.
But in every case, it started out as a small feeling and gradually got bigger and bigger and bigger. And the rational side of my mind would always kick in and say, okay, even if this feeling you're having is false, what is the harm in going down that route? You know what I mean? Like, even if it really is malaria, okay, the worst case scenario is you take him to the hospital, they confirm it's malaria, it's fine. The on the other side, if you ignore this voice and stay home and something terrible happens to this child, you will never forgive yourself. So I feel like there's intuition, but I think there's also a rational element of just assessing the two scenarios.
Right.
And it's often quite clear, not always, but often quite clear which one makes sense. When it came to leaving that hospital, I'm like, one option is I stay here to do what? Please this older doctor, and not ruffle feathers and not be assertive, which serves no one. It definitely doesn't serve my child. Or I leave, and worst case scenario is, even the third doctor doesn't know what's wrong with my son, and then I'm back to square zero, but at least I would have explored those options.
Yeah. So basically, it's like a journey from when you decide to leave the home to meeting different doctors. So it didn't really give the right straight decision, but it's gravitated to the right thing gradually, like to meeting your brother, to having confirmation with other doctors, and which is very correct. Like you said, I really like the part where you said, what's there to lose? Like, if you try, you know you tried, right? Rather than when you said, okay, what if something happens to your son and you might feel really bad about it for a long time. So yeah, I really do would pick that, because sometimes I know I've improved, but sometimes I used to struggle. Like, okay, this is not. I gravitate towards logical reasoning, not every time, but in the past I used to. But
Mm.
hearing your point of view now makes it, which I do sometimes, and say, okay, you know what? I remember there was a meeting I was supposed to have, and I wasn't feeling too fine. Normally, I would have winged it, but it was so important. I knew winging it wouldn't work. So I asked myself, like, what really gives me peace? So I listened, and what gave me peace was to cancel. So I told
Mm.
myself, if I cancel now, I have more opportunity if this person's reschedule and I come in as my best self. But if I wing it, I can't ask for a re whatever, like, to ask for a new. I've already created that impression, and that was going to be the first impression that I can't change. So I think the best thing is to always, yeah, go in line of the intuition and see how it goes. And if the logical reasoning or something else is another option, then you also try it as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. um I have the short journal that I wrote about this. Read it now, which is like a ritual for every episode, either to read the journal in the beginning or at the end. So I think I'll read it at the end this time. And if you have like your opinions about something, yeah, it's highly welcome.
Sure. Sure.
Right. Trust your intuition. Trust your intuition. If you don't, you'll burn. I know this because I've burnt a couple of times again and again until I said enough. A recent example is the weirdest story I write about. Just this one. I'll take that again. A recent example is the weirdest story about the one I'm currently writing. It's like I ignored my intuition in the past, saying to myself, "That's weird. Why would I think that would happen?" So no need to protect myself or be more aware of my environment. And then boom, what I thought to be weird in my head then happens in real life and is no longer weird. After all, but the thing is, I get burned on the repercussion of not taking precautions to protect myself. Let me be honest here. I think my ego plays a part here, telling me things are not a big deal and I will survive whatever is coming instead of removing myself or completely saving myself from mental stress or energy draining situations. But the ego didn't build overnight. I had to trace it back to growing up when I spoke exactly what was on my mind or how I viewed the situation of how it will pan out, only to be told, that's not right, that's not the right way. And gradually I absorbed that voice. So when my authentic self speaks to me, my ego, which is the voice I had adapted from people around other than myself, then it tells that will happen, or I don't think that's a good idea. But most often than not, it always is. And that's the short journal about trust your intuition.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I think that's very well said. I do think that it's a process and it comes with maturity. I think you only learn to trust your ego by going against it a number of times, and having the space to reflect and say, "Oh man, like I knew this was gonna go left, and I didn't trust myself." Um, why is that? And then next time you hear the voice, you're familiar with that feeling of, I've had this inclination before, I've gone against it, it didn't go well. And then it makes you trust the intuition. Your intuition is like a friend. The first time you meet someone, if they tell you to jump off a cliff, you likely won't do it. But if you've been friends with them for a long time, and you've seen that they've developed a method, and every time they've done it, they haven't hurt themselves, and the few times you've done baby cliffs with them and you haven't
Right.
hurt yourself, when it's time to jump off a big cliff, you will. So I think that's one thing that's worth pointing out. I think the second thing is also just being kind to yourself. You won't always trust your intuition, because things like ego, as you mentioned, come into play. Fear also comes into play. Sometimes your ego is telling you to do something that seems very not your ego, so your intuition is telling you to make a
Right.
decision that seems very counterintuitive, and so you might not. But I think having compassion with yourself, even when it does turn sideways, is also important. I think beating yourself up about it doesn't
Really work, yeah.
doesn't work, and it doesn't make you friendly towards your ego, right? So sorry, towards your intuition. In some ways, the intuition can then even start to feel like a hostile voice. So I think being friendly um, being friendly every time you go against
Yeah.
the intuition
Intuition, yeah.
is also very
Important.
important.
Yeah.
Is also very, very important. Yeah.
Because we're not like perfect. We're imperfect people who gets um stronger by what we choose. I mean, when it comes to patterns, so when we try to change something off course of what we're used to, it might be a bit hard, but over time it becomes easy. So like it is really important to be kind to oneself in the
Absolutely.
process, in the journey. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, you have one more point. Yeah.
No. I think that's basically it. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for being here at the Notes from My Journal podcast. We do hope that once again we'll be able to have a chat and one of these conversations again to have you on our podcast.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you so much.
Right.
Bye, Faye. Thank
Bye,
you. Have a
Nicola.
wonderful day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.